Hey, welcome to another exciting edition of the Give Me Liberty podcast, right here at the Standing for Freedom Center at Liberty University. And speaking of liberty, today we're on the subject of religious liberty. It is a long-standing tradition in our country, going all the way back to the founders and even before, during the time of the Great Awakening. But we're joined today by Jeremy Dys. Welcome, sir, with First Liberty.
That's right, First Liberty Institute.
And I am so thankful for the success you've had recently, landmark case with Coach Kennedy, but other cases are also being determined. And so I wanted to talk about what's the state and nature of religious liberty in 2022, especially when it comes to the courts.
Well, the state of religious liberty in this country is stronger than it's ever been, in part because a coach took a knee to stand up for your religious liberty. We all know the story of Coach Kennedy at this point, a guy who took a knee in silent prayer after the football games that he coached. He did that. We can get into his backstory. It's a fascinating backstory. But here's a guy that spent 20 years in the Marine Corps and knew what it meant to fight for freedom. And when his freedom was questioned, when he was fired from his job because he took a knee in silent prayer for a couple seconds, he decided he had to take that stand for everybody in this country, including himself. And 7 years later, the Supreme Court has come out now and said that not only was his freedom protected, or should have been protected at that time, he was free to be able to engage in that free exercise of religion. The court has now gone on to hold that that free exercise of religion, that clause in our Constitution that protects the free exercise of religion, has been way too often overlooked. In fact, it's been overlooked for almost 50 years in favor of this thing called the Establishment Clause, which also exists in our Constitution and the First Amendment. But so many public officials have outbalanced the application of those two things that they treat the Establishment Clause like this can of Lysol that they got to pull out to spray down every service whenever religion comes into the public square. And of course, they're going to eradicate every kind of disease that might be out there in case we'd be infected by the whole thing. And so Coach Kennedy's case now stands for the principle that, when religion comes into the public square, it's okay. If it comes onto school campuses, it's all right. It's going to be fine. And the point that justices are making here is they say, look, if we're going to be a tolerant and diverse society, then we need to show respect for religion. Where better to start than in the schools? And if the school districts can't teach that level of tolerance and respect for religious beliefs, things that these students are going to run into in the daily society as they become adults, then what can they actually teach?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, and this is intriguing, I'm intrigued, that it's stronger than it's ever been because this case has been won. What if those on the opposing side don't choose to live by the verdict?
Well, that's going to be an interesting thing to see here in the next couple of weeks, months, and years as we unpack this whole thing. In fact, we're already seeing even now, I've seen lawyers for city councils or county commissions saying, well, look, they could flip back to the Establishment Clause before. Look, that's not going to happen. What the justices have clearly articulated here is that the test that was previously used to determine when religion came into the public square, whether that's a monument, prayer before a public meeting, a school official referencing their faith while at work, like Coach Kennedy did, things like that. The Establishment Clause plays a role, but it doesn't play the only role. And again, the justices said, look, if you're a person of faith, you're allowed to be a person of faith in public. You don't have to leave your religion in the school parking lot in order to walk through the schoolhouse gates. Much to the contrary, the justices said, you're allowed to bring that faith with you. And in fact, if people disagree with your religious exercise as a personal conduct, if you're engaged in that kind of behavior and they don't like that, well, they don't have a heckler's veto over your religious private conduct. Mm-hmm. And so we're no longer requiring people of faith to leave their religion in the car before they walk through the schoolhouse gates or onto the football field, as the case may be for Coach Kennedy. And look, if that were the case, what would be horrible is that the reality would become you would have to leave your crucifix in the car. You'd have to leave your yarmulke in the car. You'd have to leave your hijab in the car. All these religious artifacts that are demonstrations, personal conduct, or what the school district in Bremen called demonstrative religious conduct, they'd have to leave all that behind them. They couldn't even do things like bow your head over your lunch as you say a prayer before you eat it in the school cafeteria, or say God bless you to a student who sneezes in the hallway. All that is demonstrative religious conduct that the school district would have fired people for, like Coach Kennedy, for his conduct. The Supreme Court put an end to that. That's no longer the case. Instead, they've flipped that script completely around, and this is where it becomes really important. Rather than Coach Kennedy having to defend his practice of praying by himself for 15 or 30 seconds on the 50-yard line, now those who oppose that, who believe that that is outside of the First Amendment's protection, they now have to prove that that practice somehow stands outside of the long-standing history and tradition in our country of allowing people of faith to exercise their religion wherever they may find themselves in society, or have to somehow prove that this is outside of this tradition of allowing religion in the public square.
Yeah, that is fascinating. So, and I appreciate those standards, and I appreciate your explanation of that. Do you think that given the awareness that we're seeing now, like more and more of these cases, I guess as I'm watching cases go to the Supreme Court, the thing that causes me angst is, wow, how many religious tests are being put before the court? That makes me a little uncomfortable. But are you saying that you think that it is now more secure because of the determinations of these cases, that it's going to be, we expect it to hold for decades, years and decades to come? Or is it going to be like a Roe v. Wade decision where it eventually is overturned?
No, kind of the opposite of that, that because people have stood up for the religious liberty, and Coach Kennedy in particular, we now have the position where it is assumed that if you're engaged in religious conduct, and this is what the founders wanted, by the way, if you're engaged in some sort of private religious conduct in public, then the onus, the burden is on those who disagree with that conduct to prove that you are somehow outside of the tradition of these United States. That is, so what that did was undo, what Coach Kennedy's case did was finally do away with a case called the Lemon case, Lemon versus Kurtzman. It was decided in 1972, so before Roe v. Wade. This case has been around now for 50 years, and it basically said that, look, whenever religion walks into the public square, if it's entangled somehow with the government. So think about a nativity scene on the courthouse square, or a prayer before a public meeting, a Ten Commandments monument, a cross-shaped Veterans Memorial, those kinds of things, Coach Kennedy's behavior. If religion were to somehow come into the public square and entangle itself with the government itself, so a school district or a county commission, city council, courthouse square, then the conduct has to somehow be neutral. And if it is, and you can't make it neutral, then it has to go away. So take a nativity scene. You can have a nativity scene under the previous iteration of this law if you have a couple of reindeer, Santa Claus, and maybe a Star of David out there to make it kind of like, copacetic for everybody and then neutral on the courthouse square. Well, wait a minute. We've been putting nativity scenes on the courthouse square for generations in this country, or we've had religious displays everywhere else. So now the law says if we're going to put that nativity scene out front, that's okay. If you don't like it, then you have to actually prove that it is somehow outside of the tradition of our country of respecting those who actually do appreciate a nativity scene on the courthouse square, or at least outside the tradition of welcoming religion into the public square, including the People's Square on the courthouse lawn there. So that has, again, flipped the script entirely. So we've got 5 decades in which that case was holding court, literally, in our country, striking down nativity scenes, removing Ten Commandments displays from courthouse squares or capitol areas, veterans memorials that were cross-shaped veterans memorials. We had to go to the Supreme Court to defend one of those in 2019. So all of those now, the Establishment Clause, or I'm sorry, the Lemon Test was used to take all of those down. Well, now that Coach Kennedy has allowed us to flip the script on this, to put those who would oppose those displays on the defensive, we've decided that we're now going to go on the offense as well. And all those displays that have come down, the Ten Commandments monuments that have been literally taken off the courthouse square and put on mothballs in a warehouse somewhere, or monuments that were erected by veterans' mothers who, the kids didn't come back from the war, and they erected these monuments to remember their kids who died defending our freedom and have been bulldozed down. Now we want to put those back up. The monuments and the memorials and the religious symbols that have been in the public that the courts have used this law to tear down, we're going to ask the courts now to reconsider that in light of this new law and put them back up. Because we have a long-standing tradition in this country of welcoming religion into the public square, not banishing it.
Okay, so the first thing I'm thinking to ask, just in follow-up to that, and that's very fascinating, is what are some cases right now that are being brought up before the court or are waiting, like they're on the docket, they're going to be determined maybe next year, in the next season or whatever, that are coming up that you say, hey, we're very hopeful about this case?
Oh, very hopeful. There's a case right now involving a postal worker who worked for the United States Postal Service for years. And he chose to work for the United States Postal Service in part because he did not have to work on the Sabbath, on Sunday. And as it happened, not too long ago, we'll remember that Amazon started using the Postal Service to deliver their packages on Sundays.
Yes.
And so they required him, Amazon required him now to come in on Sundays to deliver those packages. He said, wait a minute, I had a deal with the Postal Service here that says that I didn't have to work on Sunday. I would like to have the same religious accommodation, please, to be able to not have to work on Sunday. Oh, and by the way, there's other people who can do it. Here's 3 other guys who are willing to work my shift on a Sunday so that I can attend my religious services. I'll work extra hours throughout the week if I have to, but don't make me have to violate my conscience and work on a Sunday. And Amazon basically told the Postal Service, get rid of this guy because he can't work here anymore, and he was fired. Now that case is before the Supreme Court right now. We've asked them to take that case. That's going to undo a really key precedent in this country called TWA versus Hardison, which says that if it causes even a de minimis, a little tiny bit of burden for a corporation or company to accommodate your religious beliefs, then the company doesn't have to accommodate your religious beliefs at all. They can either fire you or discipline you, even if you're exercising your religion. And if we can undo that very burdensome towards religious liberty law, it's going to open up a massive amount of protection for employees across the country whose consciences are burdened on everything from a shot that the government or your employer may require you to take in order to maintain working there, but it violates your conscience, or even working on the Sabbath day, or perhaps having to go through some sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of lecture that is going to burden you to either have to listen to or more terribly have to actually apply within your day-to-day structure, whether that's referencing certain pronouns that your religion just simply cannot affirm, or whatever it might be. It's going to open up that opportunity for people of faith to be able to be respected, tolerated within the workplace itself.
Okay, real quick. Immediately when you were talking about the Sabbath, something that came to mind, movie from decades ago, Chariots of Fire. Did you ever see it?
Oh, of course.
Okay, so the story of Eric Liddell, right? He is somebody that is a Christian. He's a British track athlete, one of the fastest men on earth at the time. I want to say it was like the 1920 Olympics or something like that. But he was called to go to the mission field, to go to China, to bring the gospel there. This is pre-CCP China, by the way. And yet, he also was super fast. He qualified for the Olympic team and this, that, and the other. But the one thing that the movie shows it's a movie in the 80s, but it wanted to highlight this one aspect, which was Sabbath. He's a Presbyterian minister, and he absolutely did not want to race on Sunday. And there was a race, you recall, and set it up or whatever, and the Olympic Committee was going to disqualify him if he didn't do it. And I don't even remember how they worked
did disqualify him. They ended up switching races so that he could run a different race.
Exactly.
Right.
That's what it was. And so this has been going, I guess what I'm saying is, this has been going on for a long time. This is not anything new. And funny enough, ironically enough, by historically Christian nations, right? More recently, Franklin Graham won a case in the UK on grounds of religious liberty. He was actually discriminated from doing an event, I want to say in Scotland, Glasgow, something like that. And they shut down this event because of his, they didn't want to give him the free exercise of religion. Well, he's an American or whatever, but British laws still protect that. And he ended up winning that case, which actually would help people in England as well. I am heartened to know that we have the kind of judiciary that will uphold and affirm religious liberty. We saw the remaking of the courts under the Trump administration, over 230 judicial appointments, 3 to the Supreme Court, right? There's a huge amount of judicial appointments. There are currently something like 80 vacancies right now under Joe Biden. How important is it that I would say there's a Republican majority in the Senate, that the next slew of appointments are those who uphold and affirm the Constitution rather than being judicial activists? How important is that?
Well, we've been very concerned about that because religious liberty is one thing. The promise of the First Amendment, the laws in this country that protect religious liberty for individuals and organizations of houses of worship, religious institutions, they're vital, they're strong. We've got good case law, we've got great laws in this country, we've got an awesome Constitution, a First Amendment that protects our free exercise of religion. But they mean very little if a judge can simply come in and draw a line through all of them without much process. And so at First Liberty, we've been working very hard. We've been very concerned about recent proposals to either pack the court with more justices on the Supreme Court or expand the judiciary in some way or somehow tinker with what the Founding Fathers created. I guess I just go back to, and I should mention, we've created a website called supremecoup.com, supremecoup.com, that you can add your signature to say, hey, look, don't mess with what the Founding Fathers put together here. This is a really good system that we've got. But I go back to the really very wise words of a certain senator back during Justice Thomas's, or back during the 80s and 90s when they're considering expanding the court around Justice Thomas's appointment. And that senator said it would be a bonehead idea to expand the court. He likened it to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who said it was a bad idea, or he tried to do it, and he said that was a bonehead idea. It was a bonehead idea back in the 1930s when President FDR tried to do that.
Right.
And Joe Biden was right. It was a bonehead idea in the 90s to expand the Supreme Court, and it would be a bonehead idea today to expand the Supreme Court because that would just be, we'd pretty soon have a Supreme Court that would look like the Galactic Senate from Star Wars. It'd be so big that it would be unworkable and unwieldy. And any country that's done that has resulted in horrible decisions that affect the real day-to-day freedoms of Americans, or at least in those countries, those individuals. And it would have that same effect here in this country.
Yeah.
And so the judiciary, to have judges and justices that understand the importance of a constitution, a written document that has an actual meaning that is written down in words, and applies that to the laws and the standards of this United States and the freedoms that we have. If we lose that, then Katie bar the door. Our freedoms are completely gone and are at the whim and fancy of any either judicial activist or a lawmaker who just simply wants to run roughshod over the Constitution. If we don't protect our justices and our judiciary, then we are very close to losing our freedoms entirely. The Founding Fathers in the Federalist Papers were very concerned about this. And they talk about in the Federalist Papers that the key to our freedoms is this independent judiciary. And if we were to lose that independence on that ability to be away from the political process, not be influenced by it all, so that we have that objective standard, as objective as we can in a country of men and women, if we lose that objectivity, then we lose our freedoms entirely. So we're dedicated at firstliberty.org, at supremecoup.com, to make sure that our judiciary remains the envy of the free world, and it stays that way for generations.
I just want to contrast, thank you for that, and I want to contrast Clarence Thomas's appointment, Joe Biden's defense of the integrity of the court by not packing it, and yet you fast forward now, 30-some years later, Ketanji Brown Jackson being appointed to the court along representative intersectional qualifications, yet cannot define what a woman is. She's supposed to be appointed because she is African-American woman, but doesn't define what a woman is. And it's just, you don't necessarily have to comment on that, but it's just crazy that when you think about then versus now, it is not about being able to understand legal theory, the law, whatever. It's no. Does this person, almost like a legislative body, look like people in the community? That's all we care about.
Yeah, I hope Justice Brown turns out to be a phenomenal justice on our court.
Absolutely.
I'm concerned about her ideological commitments and what I've already seen in the questions that she's asked on the court, that does not view the Constitution as having an original meaning, and is less concerned about what that original meaning might be and its application and effect upon the laws and our freedoms in this country. Unless and until we have more justices and judges in this country that understand they have a limited role, just as all of our government is limited. And that limited role is to, as they said in Marbury versus Madison, to say what the law is according to what the Constitution says it should be. If we don't have that kind of objective evaluation of our laws, then our laws are Well, our freedoms are real subject to whatever the fancy of the judge strikes them at that moment, or whatever the lawmaker says it should be. And what that allows, by the way, to back that train further up, it allows lawmakers themselves to get away with lazy lawmaking. They don't have to take good stands on laws. They don't have to be very careful in their drafting of the legislation. Well, the courts will handle it later on. Wait a minute, you're 1/3 of the government. That's very important that you play that role, to go there and find out what the law is, apply it in our context, according to the traditions of our Constitution, so that we maximize our freedoms in this country and not punt it to some other branch of the government to take care of it instead. Your job is to say what the law is and to do what the law is. The judge's job is to make sure it agrees with the Constitution.
Fantastic. Jeremy Dys, thank you for all the work you do at the First Liberty Council. Thank you so much for coming to the Standing for Freedom Center.